My name is Harriet O'Neill, and I am Assistant Director for Humanities and Social Sciences here at the BSR. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the virtual British School at Rome, which is our way of bringing all of the lectures and conferences that we usually undertake physically here in Rome to our digital audiences. It is my pleasure to introduce the artist and academic, Professor Fiona Crisp from Northumbria University for tonight's talk. And I wanted to begin by saying that actually this is something of a return to the BSR for Fiona, because from 2001 to 2002, she was held a Wingate Scholarship in Fine Arts at the BSR, during which time she produced a work, or works called Catacombe, which was a series of large format analogue photographs generated within the early Christian catacombs of the city. And this evening, which is almost 20 years on, Fiona will discuss the seminal role these works have played in the development of her career as an artist and as an academic, and how evolving interest in the idea of radical remoteness has led to her spending the last decade working with fundamental scientists. So I think we'll get to grips with the understanding of the radical remoteness and fundamental scientists. And one such project is Material Site, which was 2016 to 18, a body of research carried out at 3 leading facilities for fundamental physics, one of which was the Laboratori Nazionali di Gran Sasso, which is a vast subterranean laboratory sited inside a mountain range in central Italy, which sounds an amazing place to be. Through her cross-disciplinary work, Fiona has come to challenge the binary approach to art-science exchange, where the dislocation of lay publics from scientific knowledge has traditionally been understood as an issue to be addressed via public outreach initiatives. But instead, Fiona looks to recent shifts in critical theory within the realm of new materialism, which I'm really excited to hear about, as to questions regarding how empirical data can be reconciled with lived experience to break down these binaries. So to this end, Fiona is a founder member of the Cultural Negotiation of Science, a research group that brings together artists, academics, and research students who practice engages with expert cultures across a broad spectrum of science and technology, so very important work. Fiona's work as an artist is represented by Matt's Gallery London and is in several national permanent collections, which include the Tate, the British Council, Arts Council, and the Government Art Collection. So before I hand over to Fiona, I should explain that I'm going to mute myself and become the blue BSR logo, but I am here. And then I'll come back at the end of Fiona's talk, which is about 50 minutes, to ask questions from myself and my colleagues, but also from you, hopefully through the Q&A function. So do type them in as Fiona is talking, and of course at the end. So, and I would also like to remind you that this lecture is being recorded. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Fiona, and you can see that the title of tonight's talk is Negotiating Radical Remoteness from Catacombs to Dark Matter Laboratories. So thank you very much, Fiona.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Harriet, and to the British School at Rome for inviting me to talk this evening. I would, of course, have loved to have been there with you in Rome as originally planned, but instead I'm speaking here from my studio in the Tyne Valley in the northeast of England, which I'm sure is considerably colder than it is with you in Rome. But the upside of presenting in this way, of course, is that people can join online. So hello to everybody who is out there in the ether, and thanks for tuning in, as it were. So, as the title of my talk tonight suggests, I'm going to be looking at this idea of radical remoteness. And I'm going to be doing that by returning to some of the work that I made whilst holding a fellowship at the BSR, which, as Harriet said, was almost 20 years ago now. And I'm going to be looking at how some of the work from this era, especially the body of work that I made in the early Christian catacombs of the city, how this work created the foundation for the things that I've been doing with fundamental science over the last decade. So I suppose in a way I'm traveling from the kind of actual darkness of the catacombs to the conceptual darkness of fundamental science. And just to clarify at the beginning, by fundamental science, I mean fields such as particle physics, astrophysics, cosmology, essentially the areas of the natural sciences that we as lay publics often find highly abstract, and therefore these fields can be some of the most difficult to engage with or assimilate. So it's a journey that's characterized by this idea of radical remoteness as a form of extreme dislocation that can happen across space and time, as well as across imagination or cognition. So, for example, a key aspect of extreme remoteness within the spheres of cosmology or fundamental physics is that space, scale, and time can mostly only be experienced indirectly or vicariously through, for example, data simulations or via remote landing crafts or through mathematical constructs or thought experiments. Remoteness within the catacombs, on the other hand, is not about physical removal. Although out of everyday sight, these are spaces we can actually inhabit, and their physicality is in fact quite overwhelming, as anyone who's travelled within the subterranean worlds of caves or mines will attest to. Here, the dislocation or dissonance comes from the erasure of coordinates that allow us to locate ourselves in time, in geography, in culture, or history. And somewhat perversely, I'm drawn to approach this radical remoteness through what could be seen as the absolutely inadequate means of photography and film. So, as already mentioned, we're going to start this story almost 20 years ago when I held a 6-month fellowship at the BSR. And I arrived in early October 2001, coincidentally in the wake of the world shifting events of 9/11. In the years prior to this, I'd established a working practice that relied on spending intensive periods of time in a given location, whereby a sustained focus allowed me to establish a relationship to space or place through building photographic images via repeated encounters with a site. And I hope it should become a bit clearer later on why I use that particular verb of building in relation to photography. My rationale for wanting to work in Rome stemmed from thinking about the city in two different ways simultaneously. The first related to how the architecture and the urban planning of Rome had evolved over the centuries in relation to the body. And by this, I mean both the corporeal and the political body. And the second was based on the control of view that Rome exerts on the visitor, often through the overwhelming prevalence of one-point perspective in the images and architecture of the city. So these twin concerns of the body and the eye run throughout the work that I eventually made in Rome. But even before travelling to the city, they were manifest in my long-term interests in buildings such as the Pantheon, which you can see here in this very old aerial shot of. Unlike most of the post-Renaissance visual spectacle of Rome, the Pantheon, with its ceiling oculus open to the sky, embodies the eye like no other space I had encountered. It holds an extraordinary tension between the body and the eye. When you enter the space, your eye is taken up to the oculus like a visual escalator, until when you have physically inhabited the space, you have visually exited it. But interestingly, despite the fact that the Pantheon held such significance for me, throughout my time in Rome, I was unable to take a single image of the Pantheon's interior or exterior. And this was because throughout the first couple of months of the fellowship, I was caught in a paradoxical situation. I had come to Rome partly because of an innate fascination with how art, architecture, and urban planning controls our visual and by extension our cognitive and social or political encounter with space and place. But precisely because of this phenomenon, I was finding the visual spectacle of the city so controlling that it was virtually impossible for me to work with a camera without producing visual cliches. My relation to the city was very much driven by my particular relation to photography, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context here. As an artist and as an academic, my long-term interest has been in the ontology and the phenomenology of the photographic object, what the photograph is in and of itself and how we experience it. In this respect, it is the language of sculpture that forms my mother tongue. This means when I use a camera, beyond image making, I'm thinking about space or mass or the experience of material encounter. In this regard, it's the photography's limits as much as its capabilities that I find compelling. And indeed, it's the idea of the photograph's inability to adequately embody presence, its phenomenological failure, if you like, that has gone on to form one of the key conceptual conduits through which I've interacted with physicists and the environments of fundamental science. But to return to Rome for a minute, to overcome this paradoxical impasse that I have described, I turned to using pinhole cameras. And this was a process that I had used with previous projects, but in Rome, I developed a set of about a dozen cameras to accommodate large format negative film. And although very low tech, these cameras were built with cardboard, tape, insulation, strip and copper for the lenses. Despite this, they were nevertheless really precisely made. So this is a 90mm camera, so slightly wide angle for large format film. But the key aspect of the cameras was that they had no viewing system. They therefore removed the primacy of sight from the process of making an image. So these images that I'm showing you are collectively entitled Santa Maria, and they form a series of 7 pinhole works that I made in 7 churches. And in these spaces, instead of actively composing an image with the use of a viewfinder, as you would in a conventional camera, the pinhole camera instead became a sort of companion placed on the seating, or in this case, the pew next to me. And this is where I come back to this idea of building an image, because these works were evolved over many, many iterative visits. And during the initial encounter with a space, I would place the camera next to me, only sort of determining the general direction of view. And the exposure time was dictated by my attention span in any given situation. So probably, about half an hour. I would then go away and develop and print the negative. And when I returned to the space, I would position the camera again. But this time, the positioning would be determined by my memory of the printed image. I would then repeat the process again and again, each time recalibrating the positioning and exposure time. And in this way, I established a process whereby an image was iteratively built through a triangulation of place, image, and experience. So I think this was something like the 32nd time that I returned to Santa Maria del Popolo, and only on this occasion had the cleaner in the church realign the pews in this exact formal arrangement, and only at this exact period of day was there this differential of light in the church interior that allowed this composition to occur. On other occasions, events took place within the extended exposure time of the pinhole photograph. This was the final work I made in Rome, and I knew it would be my last opportunity to make an image in Santa Maria in Trastevere. And I was positioned right at the back of the church, but as I started to make the exposure, the back doors of the church opened and a funeral began to process up the aisle. And I was, of course, mortified. I was caught in this ethical dilemma as to whether to stay in the church, but at the same time not wanting to create noise by moving. So what I did, I closed my eyes and I just stayed frozen for the entirety of the funeral service while the photograph exposed. And I'm still really unsure as to the kind of ethical status of the image. Technically, it didn't document the funeral. There's nothing that moves within a 45-minute exposure time registers, only what is still registers. But there's something really compelling about this knowledge that service is embedded in this image. And it's sort of like filmic time contained within photographic time. So this idea of embodied experience is really important because, as I said, it's the photographic object that's vital to me. And in this respect, it's the act of looking, our physical encounter with the work, that's key. So added to that triangulation I mentioned of space, image and experience, then there is also the space and time of the viewer or audience, and how the work is kind of reenacted or re-expanded into the space and time of the viewer's encounter. These 7 works, along with the 32 benches you can see here, were created for the context of Aspects Gallery in Portsmouth, who had commissioned me before I travelled to Rome to make an exhibition. So whilst I was on the fellowship, I'd been thinking about this kind of strange hybridity of the space that was Aspects at that time, that oscillated between this church and a white cube gallery space. And I was also thinking about the different forms of looking that these respective spaces of church and gallery might engender. But the experience of working in the Early Christian Catacombs was totally unexpected. A couple of months into the residency, I started visiting various catacombs across the city as a tourist. But in these particular catacombs, I was immensely moved by the intense sculptural interiority of the space. And it struck me that they operated as a kind of reverse architecture, in that they were made from in so much as they were made from extraction rather than construction, creating an architecture that has no exterior, but is instead completely hermetic. Within these subterranean spaces, the stability of light and climate are absolute. And apart from the anachronistic presence of modern safety lighting, these particular catacombs have been in a state of stasis for hundreds of years. So I knew that I wanted to work in these spaces, but I realized that I would need access for long periods of time, because somewhat perversely, I decided that I wanted to continue using pinhole cameras with large format analog film. And given the lighting conditions, this would necessitate exposures for several hours at a time. So after some protracted negotiations, I did indeed manage to get access and worked in these catacombs over a period of about 3 months. And this resulted in a body of 5 works, which I know doesn't correspond to my titling, which is somewhat esoteric, my numbering system. Anyway, these works have over time revealed themselves as seminal to my working practice, not least because they established a conceptual and philosophical territory for me. I've often described the images that I make as non-documentary because, despite the fact that the photographs are, in literal terms, a document of a specific site, they have no documentary intent. And by this, I mean that there's no narrative drive, no conveyance of meaning beyond the image's own internal presence. And in this respect, it's how something is looked at by the camera rather than what is looked at in terms of subject. But of course, this is really difficult as an idea to convey when you're working in the field. If you request access to a site, particularly an historical site, and turn up with photography equipment, even if it isn't conventional, like my pinhole cameras, there's an expectation that you are there to document, to narrate histories and convey information. And this is a tendency that I have referred to in the past as a form of documentary burden. So this is why I found it important to establish a different intentionality for the work. And it's why I'm outlining these things here, because it's from this particular positioning that I have gone on to approach the physical, philosophical and conceptual concerns of other expert cultures, rather than proceeding from the position of wanting to document or illustrate other fields of practice. In contrast to a documentary image, in this body of work, many of the conventional markers of photography that we might use to orientate ourselves in relation to an image, our reading of light, of time, of climate, or a spatial or cultural location, these markers are all either only partial or suspended altogether. In this context, I started thinking about the photographs as constructions of an impossible space. As I mentioned, apart from the modern safety lighting that's been installed, these spaces have remained unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the act of photographing was a kind of reiteration. You could almost think about it as a form of tautology that involved taking still images of a space that was already still or already in a state of suspension. So within the 3 hours that it took to expose the negative, a filmic time was opened up. But unlike inside the church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, where the funeral service took place, this was a time of utter stasis. So it was like splitting open time from itself, or space from itself. And it's in this respect that I thought about the resulting photograph as embodying spatial and temporal dimensions that were somehow impossible. It was like a time and place had been cracked open in the photographic object that we couldn't get back into, we couldn't re-inhabit. And this is what I thought about as a place of radical remoteness. So the Catacombs became the first in a series of works carried out in underground environments subsequently over the following 7 years. And these were eventually brought together in this solo touring exhibition, Subterranean, that opened at Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in the UK. In addition to the Catacombs, Subterranean brought together 4 further bodies of work that ranged across geographies, identities and timeframes, including sites built for military, civic and commercial purposes. These included both working and disused mines, as well as a German military hospital from the Second World War. But like the Catacombs, the spaces shared a common ontological root, in so much as they were all interior architectures formed through excavation and with no exterior. And again, like the Catacombs, within these hermetic environments, many of the key markers of photography, such as light, time or space, were either destabilized or suspended altogether. So I'm just showing you a couple of slides here so you get a sense of the kind of navigation of the exhibition. It was this collective sense of suspension, as well as pursuing that idea of the spaces as somehow apparatic or impossible, as I've already described, that sat at the core of Subterranean as an installation. And it was echoed in the name Subterranean itself, which exists as neither a word or a place. It's a kind of fabrication. The final body of work made for Subterranean was created in Bolby Mine off the northeast coast of England. Bolby is the UK's deepest working mine, where they excavate potash and rock salt. And when I first sought access to matework at Bolby, it was the extraordinary geological engineering of the mine itself that was my focus, as it goes out for several miles underneath the bed of the North Sea. But I was also interested in the fact that the mine hosts Bolby Underground Laboratory, which is a state-of-the-art facility for dark matter research, where astrophysicists and cosmologists are, amongst other things, looking for the 95% of the universe that's currently unaccounted for. So this was really the project that segued into my interest in speaking with fundamental scientists and spending time in the spaces in which they work. And after a mere 6 years spent establishing research relationships, trialing working methodologies and bid writing, of course, I established the project Material Site. So starting with the credits here, this slide gives you an overview of the structure of Material Site and the partners involved. The project ran between 2016 and 2018, and as you can see here, it was funded by a Leverhulme Research Fellowship, and this supported me to work with these 3 world-leading facilities for fundamental physics in Italy and the UK, including, as Harriet mentioned, the Laboratori Nazionali di Gran Sasso, which is about 2 hours northeast of Rome. And the project was hosted by the UK-based organisation Arts Catalyst, who have a laudable history of supporting artists, scientists and technologists to establish innovative interdisciplinary practices. As flagged at the beginning of my talk tonight, we know that fundamental science is one of the hardest areas of the natural sciences for lay publics to connect to. Its spatial and temporal scales range from the unimaginably small realm of the subatomic to abstract concepts of the incalculably large, like that of the multiverse, for instance. Consequently, it's really difficult to imaginatively or cognitively connect across this kind of range of scale and speed and distance, especially for non-scientists. Instead, when we attempt to approach the ideas of paralysing abstraction through the perceptual range of our sensing bodies, a form of perceptual vertigo can be provoked. And I've come to think about this through undertaking this project as a form of phenomenological dissonance. And by this, I mean dissonance between material presence on the one hand and a kind of radical remoteness on the other. And I'm really only just beginning to evolve this concept of phenomenological dissonance as I write about Material Site retrospectively. But at its outset, the project was premised on questions about how fundamental physics might be brought back into what the philosopher Edmund Husserl called the life world, or as the contemporary astronomer Roger Molina put more directly, how do we make physics intimate? To this end, Material Site was driven by the paradoxical desire to create a sensorium for fundamental physics. And in doing so, I was asking if photography, film and sound could embody the spaces of experimental science and present them back to scientists and non-scientists alike, not as illustrations of the technical sublime, which we see so often with image making in relation to technology. Not this, but instead as sites of phenomenological encounter. The conceptual coordinates of Material Site in relation to photography as non-documentary and embodied were very much as I've set out already this evening, and the project's methodological design was premised on the production of knowledge through the act of looking. In both these respects, Material Site emphatically resisted the gravitational pull of art to be instrumentalized as an illustrative device within scientific contexts. And this is really important as a point, this kind of resistance of illustration or art being instrumentalized. So just to give you a very brief whistle-stop tour of the scope of the project, as I said, the fellowship allowed me the time for repeated field trips to the 3 research facilities, building on methodologies of iterative working and exchange developed over the previous decade. And the project came to fruition by way of 2 exhibition installations. The first at the Northern Gallery of Contemporary Art, as the slides that I've been showing you already. And the second very different iteration of the installation at Arts Catalyst in London. And both of the exhibitions brought together a body of large-scale photographic objects, film works, and an immersive soundscape, along with a set of 7 bespoke steel benches. Throughout the project, there was a series of public workshops, and the middle slide on the left here shows images from a fantastic workshop delivered by physicist Dr. Mark Nayrink, who, when I met him, was a research fellow at the Institute of Computational Cosmology in Durham. And he was using origami as a tool to research the structure of our local universe. And I just thought that this was extraordinary, that Mark was using origami as this physical manifestation of mathematical constructs. And he was using this to think through the rotational evolution of dark matter filaments. And the premise of this, if not the complex science, but the premise of it made utter sense to me. To use this analog means to think through these dense, complex and abstract ideas. But it was interesting because it was just anathema to his colleagues at the ICC to do such a thing. But as I had hoped and expected, it worked brilliantly as a workshop where people had this kind of haptic bridge to bring these remote concepts literally into their own hands, as Mark was talking about his research. So as well as the workshops, we developed experimental performative events that were designed to move away from the usual tropes of public engagement, where art's so often used to illustrate science for outreach or impact. And again, this is another key area where art is instrumentalized to kind of give added value to science, and sadly it's a kind of a tendency that's often encouraged by structures of funding and commissioning, and I think this leads to a kind of an asymmetry created by this kind of fairly mercenary exchange of services, whereby access for artists is kind of exchanged or traded for outreach and impact for scientific institutions. And we also work to build a network of physicists, artists, curators and writers, primarily via an experimental symposium at the Institute of Physics. And during this time, 2 distinct but intimately related themes began to emerge concerning physics in culture and the culture of physics. And these themes were subsequently became the twin foci for the book, The Live Creature in Ethereal Things, which is a collection of essays, images, and short texts that present fundamental physics and the physics of the universe as human activities and cultural endeavours. So you can buy this book as a hard copy, but just to say it's also available as a free to download e-publication if you want to have a look at it. Right, but to return to the research process itself, one of the project partners was the combined facilities at Durham University that include the Centre for Advanced Instrumentation and the Precision Optics Laboratory, which, amongst other things, make instruments such as spectrometers and telescopes that provide the data to be used by the Institute of Computational Cosmology here for researching the origins and the evolution of the universe and for constructing visualizations. So working with the ICC provided a rich territory for me to engage scientists in conversations about the ontology and phenomenology of photography from our kind of relative perspectives. And given that the researchers at the ICC are working between observed, enhanced and constructed imagery, I was interested to understand how they thought about photography's indexical relationship to the world. And it was really interesting. I did a kind of recorded conversation with two of the researchers there at the ICC. And Professor Richard Bauer, who works with constructing these visualizations completely out of data, made this remark. He said, "I'm trying to make a universe and then be part of that universe, even though it doesn't exist." And again, I thought this was really fascinating, because as he was constructing these visualizations, he was really talking about situating himself in it, and even talking about the eye and the kind of position of the eye in relation to the navigation of the visualizations. I'm just going to start this as a moving image. So I also wanted to ask how the models and simulations that they make at the ICC are culturally received. Some of the visualizations, for example, retain an indexical link to the observed cosmos, while other simulations are built entirely from numerical data and therefore have greater parallels with virtual reality. But often visualizations conflate observed and constructed imagery, as with this fly-through animation that another researcher there, Professor Swinbank, and his team at the ICC produced using the famous Hubble ultra deep field image. So starting with the original still image from the Hubble telescope, we're animated back through space and time. So we're traveling towards the origins of the universe here. And this work fascinated me because it took a still image that was directly observed by the Hubble, albeit remotely and in a composite of several hundred exposures taking over a 3-month period. But it took this still image and it expanded it through imaginative conjecture into temporal and spatial dimensions that we will never observe or experience directly. So, as mentioned, I also worked with the Laboratori Nazionali di Gran Sasso, and this is one of the world's largest subterranean research facilities for particle physics and astrophysics. And as can be seen here, it's sited inside rather than underneath the ground in the Gran Sasso mountain range in central Italy. And the 3 vast underground halls that make up the laboratory are each, I was told, the volume of the interior of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And these halls were mined in the 1980s when the Autostrade tunnel passing underneath the Gran Sasso mountain range was excavated. But interestingly, like a megalithic tomb built in relation to the sun, the halls of Gran Sasso were excavated in alignment to CERN on the French-Swiss border, in an uncanny anticipation of the famous CERN neutrinos to Gran Sasso beam that was sent from the super proton synchrotron at CERN to Gran Sasso to test neutrino oscillation from 2006 to 2012. So this was a neutrino beam originating at CERN and traveling 732 kilometers down through the Earth of Europe, arriving at Gran Sasso in 2.5 milliseconds. And the huge opera experiment at Gran Sasso was built to detect the beam using a target of 156,000 what they call bricks. And each of these bricks was made from large format photographic film, so the same size as I used in my pinhole cameras, interleaved with sheets of lead, and each weighing approximately 9 kilograms, so really heavy. And the opera experiment's now disassembled, but an archive of bricks had been retained for future research. And incredibly, they allowed me to have 3 of these bricks, which now sit in my studio here in the UK, like these kind of dense, inert cameras. And of course, I don't possess the advanced scanning technology to read the emulsion plates, but the sealed contents of each brick hold the potential, albeit highly unlikely, but the potential of a trace of a tau neutrino event that had travelled that 732 kilometres in 2.5 milliseconds. So to hold this considerable 9 kilogram mass of the brick whilst contemplating the paralysing abstraction of that beam is, I would say, a kind of masterclass in phenomenological dissonance. But of course, it also constitutes a kind of intimate performative encounter with the apparatus of fundamental science. So, as already mentioned, the third partner, Bolby Underground Laboratory, is located in the UK's deepest working mine that stretches out many kilometres underneath the bed of the North Sea in this series of labyrinthine tunnels. And within Material Site, I was interested in how the idea of impossible space that I developed within the Subterranean project, how this might map over the idea of radical remoteness within physics and cosmology, where spatial and temporal scales can only be experienced indirectly or vicariously. Likewise, in both projects, my use of photography and film are non-narrative, and it's the photographic or film object as an embodied non-documentary phenomenon that I'm interested in using to elicit a visceral response in the viewer ahead of a kind of intellectual reading. To this end, the exhibition sought to create a sensorium not only through visual and formal means, but via a combination of haptic connection and intense oral experience. Within the installations, the soundtracks from the 4 separate films were choreographed to form a spatial soundscape that moved the visitor around the scaffolding screens and the steel benches, and the sound sometimes layering, sometimes building to pitches that kind of overwhelm the body, and sometimes just stopping abruptly and producing this kind of equally intense feeling of kind of ringing silence. So I'm going to show you a short couple of minutes of film that hopefully will work, but hopefully will also give you an idea of the soundscape, because of course it's impossible to convey this in still images. So this film starts with one of the films that is taken in Bolby mine, and it's travelling out towards the mining face, several kilometres out underneath the North Sea. So you can see it's a real relief when it stops. But I hope that gives you a little more of an insight into the intensity of the work, or the experience of the work, because it was really unavoidable not to kind of experience it in your body, you know, in your kind of gut. So the two installations varied greatly in their size, setting and tone, and the cavernous hermetic space of the NGCA contrasted to the permeable street-side galleries of the Arts Catalyst in London, where the benches were positioned both inside and outside the gallery spaces. And at both sites, the scaffolding structures were built into the architecture of the spaces, supporting the film screens, photographic works, speakers, wiring, media players, and amps. And within this kind of integrated sculptural apparatus, all elements were presented together as undifferentiated material objects, with the backs of the screens given, you know, equal importance to the face, so not kind of privileging image over object. So within the moving imagery, I just wanted to talk about these kind of two tropes of looking that were involved. The first I thought about as a kind of laboratory life that are premised on an intimacy of looking, which is different to looking at something that's intimate, but rather a kind of close observation that allows the space for the meanings to be made from the rhythms and the sounds, the colours and the movements of things going on. And these films were often close cropped with a fixed kind of face-on static camera, where the movements contained within the image. And this desire to build knowledge through looking underpins the idea that the laboratory is a social, cultural and political space where meaning is shaped and constructed rather than received or observed. In the second trope of looking, the camera embodies movement, actively ranging through, under, over and across the sites themselves. Collectively, the films were intended to build a formal and experiential expression of endeavour. And with the oral layering of the soundscape, literally positioning itself, as I said, within our bodies. Okay, so we're going to leave material site now, and I'm just going to end now by saying a little bit about what I'm working on at the moment, which is this project, Fundamental, that's really come out of the work done during material site. And this is a working title, by the way. I'm not sure if it'll end up being called this. But the intention is to keep the momentum built through the work I've been showing you, but to more explicitly challenge the binary approach to art-science exchange, where the dislocation of lay publics from scientific knowledge has traditionally been understood as an issue to be addressed via public outreach initiatives. So instead, the work will look to the critical realm of new materialism through writers like Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, as well as to questions regarding how empirical data can be reconciled with lived experience to break down these binaries. And the project aims to challenge existing kind of instrumentalized models of collaborative practice, I suppose, between the cultures of arts and science. And instead, it approaches knowledge-making practices as social material enactments that contribute to and are part of the phenomenon we describe, which, as you can see here, is a quote from Karen Barad. In this respect, artists, scientists and publics are placed inside of and indivisible from the knowledge making process itself. And I'm thinking about this in itself as a kind of fundamental repositioning, which, you know, could possibly have profound kind of implications. The huge question, of course, is how do you do this? It will be a project with multiple partners, some existing, some new. It's fluid and active and still morphing at the moment. And I'm still trying to acknowledge and assimilate the implications of our current pandemic situation, not just for the logistics of the project, which, like everything else, has been impactful, but for the foundational principles, really, of what the project is trying to do. So trying to kind of realign those ideas. But one of the key areas that I'm interested in is developing new approaches to the idea of residency, and what it is to work across and in between cultures of practice, and what we might do to kind of crack open this space, forming kind of interstitial spaces, if you like, interstitial spaces. And this mirrors Karen Barad's idea of interaction as opposed to interaction. So these intentions are shaping some of the project partners, and these will include ARPS at CERN, as well as the British School at Rome, who, as we all know, have established histories, great histories of hosting residencies. And it's really interesting to think about what would happen, for instance, if a fundamental scientist was embedded in the research milieu of the arts and humanities at the BSR. Okay, I think I come to the end of my time possibly, but I'm just going to leave you with a couple of web addresses, one for the Material Site project that links through to kind of lots of different aspects of the projects, and as well as the book download that I mentioned. There's also a film that gives a bit more of an overview of the two exhibitions. And secondly, the link for the Cultural Negotiation of Science group, which Harriet mentioned. This is a research group that I founded with colleagues to bring together artists and academics and research students whose practices engage with expert cultures across a broad range of science and technology. So, you know, not just fundamental science, but biomedical, genetics, climate science. And just to point out, there's two addresses, because the current site, which is the .ac.uk, is it's currently unavailable because we had a hideous cyber attack at the university. So I've put this old address in brackets, which is the non-updated site, but at least it gives you something to kind of peruse for the minute, and hopefully the other site will be up and running as soon as possible. Okay, so I will leave it there. I will stop sharing my screen, and many thanks for listening.